Now, as always, I love pointing out the difference between this mob when they were in opposition, the standards they demanded, and that Australians expected when they got this government a couple of years ago. One of the constant refrains of the now Treasurer when he was in opposition was that the previous government was one of the biggest taxing, if not the biggest taxing, of all time.
They've taxed more than the last Labor government did. They've taxed more as a proportion of the economy in total, adjusted for inflation and per person as well. On every measure, they've taxed more, borrowed more and spent more than the last Labor government, but delivered much, much less.
It was their version of saying that fiscal responsibility. The Labor Party often has the same message, they just rebadge it. They put new lipstick on the same old pig and often voters fall for it, and then eventually, a couple of terms later, they realise this was the wrong way to go. Well, perfect example of that is the numbers that we saw today that show this government is the highest taxing of all time. It is also the highest spending, or close to the highest spending. Have a look at this graph. This is for all government, be it state and local, that's the green, the total, which is the red, but have a look at the blue in the middle. You can see there that the federal government is currently taxing way more than the previous government did. You know this because, of course, they absolutely steadfastly refuse to do things like cut petrol taxes, on top of the income taxes, the bracket creep, all of the things that we talk about here, but seemingly don't matter to too many others. I'm glad it matters to you because it certainly matters to me. And what about their spending habits? Well, again, same source. The red is total, the green is state and local government that actually end up spending more, but of course the GST revenue that comes from the federal government is the reason they end up spending more. But have a look at that blue line. Last time I checked, that is a little higher than it was previously, let alone before that, let alone a generation before that, let alone back into the Howard days. And this is something that this government is addicted to. It's not just spending each and every year, it's permanent spending that they lock into the budget. As populations grow, that spending increases. And when you're in a surplus, that's okay, but as soon as you start to go into deficit, guaranteed locked-in spending, well, it pushes you deeper and deeper into deficit. Now, again, this government most likely will find a way, thanks to the mining revenue and this taxation, to be able to say they're in a surplus. But the expectation structurally about where the Australian budget is that, according to the Intergenerational Report, we will go into deficits for the next 40 years. And they get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So the government does need to find a way to supplement its income, but in my view, it needs to do something to cut its spending. Now, I'm not going to complain about spending like superannuation guarantees for people who are on paid parental leave. But what's $200 million locked into the budget today becomes $250, $300 and so on as the population grows. Equally, when they turned around and put millions of dollars in as guaranteed support payments on top of the wages of aged care workers. It starts as this big a number and then it grows and grows and grows. Perfect example of this is the NDIS. Now, these policies always start as something nobody could possibly disagree with, but also no one has a plan to pay for them. Now, increasingly, Australians will say that they care about debt and they care about tax, but the second anyone moves $1 in the Australian budget, people start to set their hair on fire. And while it is nowhere near $100 million, it's nowhere near $1 billion in structural spending, plenty of people have understandably seen examples of how the government spends money on itself, on its own luxuries, like Tony Perk, as he was called by Chris Kenny, or, of course, plenty of other names which have come around for him, like Flight Centre Burke, I think is a good one that Ray Hadley had today. And it's worth pointing out again, for a 4-day trip to the United States, this bloke cost us the best part of $60,000. Now, for some people, that's an entire year's wage. To the people at the front end of the plane, they don't care. Remember, this government increased the number of staffers in every parliamentarian's office. Millions and millions of dollars forever baked into the budget because they had to deal with the pressures of social media. These are the people who give themselves, completely independent, give themselves the highest pay rises in 10 years, far from what you've been experiencing or I. But as it was with Stephen Miles and being caught just bald-faced lying, if you want to reintroduce trust to Australian politics, and again, this was one of the many promises that have never come true of this government, because the snout in the trough is always more comfortable than when you're on the opposition side of things and you're pointing out how many snouts are in the trough, and one of the reasons why you're annoyed is because your snout is not in the trough. This government, when asked about Tony Burke's expenses, now again, they want you to talk about Peter Dutton paying his own way to go to Perth for a birthday last week. But this was federal government ministers who all promised to do better than the last mob, saying it's completely okay that a bloke went to the United States for 4 days, took a staffer and cost $60,000.
Oh, look, I don't pore over the declarations made by other ministers, to be frank. You know, I saw that there was a story in the paper about it. I didn't dwell on it.
So much of our defence, of our trade, of our national security depends on these close relationships that we have with other countries, and it does require overseas travel. That's what Minister Burke was doing.
But as Jane Hume quite correctly pointed out, that's not his job. He's the arts minister, among other things. And again, there's something good about a relationship and always being stronger and closer to the United States than China, but come on. At what point does anyone get pulled up on this? Or is the assumption that the media is so friendly to them that this will just be a yesterday's story, one that's only mentioned in the pages of the Australian newspaper and mentioned in Sky News primetime, and thus, according to this mob, completely ignorable? Another broken promise was, remember this one, from the Finance Minister and apparently Deputy Prime Minister, according to some that are disgruntled by the new Gang of Four that is running the country right now, that being Chalmers, Wong, Gallagher and the Prime Minister. No different than, of course, the kitchen cabinet Gang of Four, which Kevin Rudd put around him, and didn't that end oh so well? Well, this is what she had to say about jobs for the boys.
We've announced a review of the public sector board appointment process. This is really to end the culture of jobs for mates. We want to change the appointments, really important appointments across the APS, often well paid as well, that ensure that people actually get appointed for what they know, not who they know, which is a bit of a change from the last 10 years.
But then, within the first 12 months of this government, the Trade Minister decided to appoint a mate, and by who you know, this is about as who you know as it gets. Remember that a bloke who ended up in a trade portfolio in San Francisco representing Australia in the United States is a former Labor senator, whose mate is Don Farrell, who of course made the appointment. An independent board had already picked somebody for this job, and it was a woman who actually applied for the job. The bloke didn't even apply for the job, and the lady who was supposed to get the job ended up having to train the bloke who had no experience in the job that should have been for her. But another example about jobs for the mates and how they're able to continue a life outside of government while working for government at the same time, as long as it's in service of the political outcome of the Labor Party, well, it all has to do with whom this government appointed to have a look into supermarkets. The Albanese government is trying to follow the successful politics, nasty politics as it was, but successful politics of pretending that despite the fact that they have very serious roles in the economy, it's all somebody else's fault. Now, their suggestion is that it's the supermarkets themselves that are price gouging. That's the view of the unions, that's backed up by the ABC. And of course, that is the real problem in Australia with the cost of groceries. Not at all things like petrol tax, not at all things like trucking taxes, not at all the cost of power to keep the power on in your suburban shops, which costs way more because this government's gone from the system that works to the one that makes them feel good. And the person who they appointed to have a look into how all of this worked is a former Labor MP, Minister, in Dr. Craig Emerson. Now, he at one point in time actually had responsibility for the shambles of a policy that was Grocery Watch. The Grocery Watch system, where they were expecting a website to update what everything was worth, but obviously they weren't able to keep the data up to date, so the whole thing collapsed. Instead, their policy now is to give a couple of $1 million to a third-party organisation to do exactly the same thing. Because every idea, no matter how bad, no matter how discredited, if it's a Labor idea, it sticks around like a bad smell forever. But back to the jobs for the mates bit here. Now, Dr. Emerson, who, yes, is well and truly qualified to have a position on competition policy and all the rest of it here. But of course, the reason he got the job was because he is one of the mates. He's one of the old boys. He's one of the mates of Albo. Now, what's interesting here is that despite the fact that he has been given responsibility by this government to talk about things inside the economy, he's still allowed to free range and give very political opinions while working for the government at the same time. You see, he gets to be former politician and commentator at the same time as active participant in decisions that are being made by the government. He maintains a column in the Australian Financial Review, and he hits as hard as Nasty Nikki Savra and all the rest of those who want to change the subject from the performance of this government to the responsibility of everyone else but this government. Just this week, he was screaming about the need for there to be, the past couple of weeks I should say, cuts for the Reserve Bank. And before that, he turned around and said about the Dunkley by-election that it set up Labor's 2025 win. Geez, it must be good to have friends who can both work for the government and commentate on behalf of the government outside. But of course, as Bronwyn Bishop says, one rule for them, one rule for everyone else.